Good morning, buenos dias. I'm Claudia Romo Edelman. This is the Hispanic Response and Recovery Plan. This is the weekly update on COVID-19 that we bring to the Hispanic leaders so that we can be informed and we can take better decisions, bringing you the state of art from policy, health, economy, business, best practices, and geopolitics. Again, trying to understand what the situation in weekly basis is so that we can take better decisions. As every week, I'm delighted to have an incredible panel of high-level Hispanic stars, whether they are Hispanics or not, like Bret, Kemp, that we're going to be adopting. We're going to start with the weekly update from Dr. David Nabarro from the World Health Organization Special Envoy on COVID. Dr. David Nabarro, please.
Greetings to everybody who's joining this podcast within the Hispanic Star community. I smile, but I have to say today, June the 1st, I'm feeling really sad. Sad because we see the signs of anger and despair among so many American people about where they are right now. Suffering from long periods of inequality, of discrimination that sometimes seem to be just so powerfully ingrained in the structures of US society, and I must say also in Western European society as well. And I know that as you are feeling this anger and sadness and anxiety all coming together, you'll be asking yourselves, is there going to be good coming out of this? And my only comment as somebody who's worked with structural inequity for 45 years as a public health doctor, that yes, good will come. We can't tell exactly how it will come, or who will lead it, or where it will happen. But there is such profound goodness in the human spirit, and that will come through. We're capable of so much more as human beings than we've demonstrated so far in the history of humankind. And why do I say that? Because COVID is revealing so much about the inequities in our societies. We see how the poorest people are suffering the most as a result of this disease. We see how they work in conditions where they find it really hard to protect themselves against the disease. And we see their bravery and their willingness to continue serving the people with whom they work, sometimes despite their knowledge that they're facing threats to their well-being. But I want to say that it's that spirit of humanity that we're seeing through COVID that is so important for the future. And I remain steadfastly optimistic because I see so much good energy everywhere. I am anxious, though, about many aspects of COVID and the way it is biting into people's lives, making people poorer, hungry, children are undernourished, women are facing massive extra burdens on their lives, children are not getting the education they need, mental health is sometimes really threatened, and those who have to work in close quarters, often in caring roles, find it hard to keep those they care for and themselves safe. I ask you to work with me, to tell me what you're seeing, to show me your concerns, share them with Hispanic Star, share them with me, because I am more than ever now campaigning for working conditions that do not put people at risk of COVID and other threats to their well-being. Just as I'm campaigning for nutrition, campaigning for sustainable development, campaigning for equity. You might have heard that the organization with whom I'm working, the World Health Organization, is once again the target of frustration from the United States. I want to tell you that me and my colleagues in the World Health Organization, there's 7,000 altogether, working all over the world in more than 100 countries, 6 regional hubs, and a headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. We work just for one thing, that is the health and well-being of everybody everywhere, regardless of their wealth, their nationality, their ethnicity, regardless of their sex or their sexual identity. We work for everybody equally, and we'll go on doing that. Nothing will stop us. And it's a real sadness to us, disappointment to us, that the countries that govern the World Health Organization are unable to agree on how they want to work. But I'll say that most of the countries are supporting us in what we try to do. But we continue to try to find out what this means. We continue to believe in the generosity and global reach of the American people who've always supported global health so many years. And we hope that it will be possible for them to stay working with us fully, because this COVID is such a huge challenge for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. David Nabarro. Bret Stephens, op-ed columnist of the New York Times. I mean, like this is almost like the films that you and I watched when we were kids in Mexico City, of like New York City and Gotham City, and you know, like the takeover and the chaos and everything happening. WHO, the U.S. getting out of the WHO and an election year, riots and so much anger and COVID. And when we were thinking about like Hispanics coming back to work and how to work with the WHO precisely to give them a stamp, like a health check, so that we can go back to work. Now you started this conversation a couple of weeks ago saying that you were scared that this was going to actually go wider. The division, the divisiveness, the polarizing. What's your take about what's happening, and what do you think we should be doing? What do you see?
Well, first of all, I think I should start out by saying that it's been one of the most heartbreaking weeks in American history, and the what I believe is the murder of George Floyd is something that should raise the consciousness of everyone in this country with respect to racial polarization, division, inequality, and injustice. And I think all of our thoughts this week have to be devoted in some big way toward figuring out how we start to have the kinds of conversations and take the kinds of actions that we need to begin to heal those wounds. I think we are very far from even the beginning of those conversations, but that's where our minds really need to be. I have been warning for some time, or fearing, I should say, for some time, Claudia, that the consequences of COVID will not be limited to COVID alone. That what began as a public health crisis was inevitably going to spiral into a socioeconomic crisis, and we are seeing that with the huge and steadily growing unemployment figures, and that eventually that would become not just a domestic political crisis, but an international crisis. And that is sadly very much the way in which it is playing out now. I hate to be pessimistic, because at the end of the day, there is always hope. But I don't think we are even at the end of the beginning, much less the beginning of the end, to borrow that famous Churchillian phrase, that what has begun in the first months of 2020 is going to define not just our year, but is likely going to define this entire decade. That said, decisions that we make now, the way we approach problems now, I think will matter for the future. One thing that I think is very important for us to do, and I wish we had done it 3.5 years ago or so, is to try to reject demagogic leadership and divisive leadership wherever it appears, and to remember that we ought to be one country in this together. So efforts that are coming from all the usual places to use the tragedies of the last week to further divide and polarize society are things that the Hispanic community has to join in standing up to and against. Because this is Hispanic Star, I feel like it's important to just mention the consequences for the Hispanic community. Rightly, I think we've been focused on the endless legacy of injustice with respect to African Americans, but Hispanic Americans are also suffering now, and suffering in ways that perhaps we have not paid the kind of attention that they deserve. And that's happening not only in the form of prejudice and discrimination, but it's also happening in the form of economic disempowerment. Those stores that are being smashed by a handful of looters and bad actors, that is taking an outsized toll on Hispanics, both US citizens and non-US citizens who work in these places and who depend on being able to go to a job every day for their immediate livelihood and for the well-being of their families, whether they're in the United States or somewhere in Latin America. And just as we should have been more attentive at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis to the economic fallout, I think now is the time to be particularly attentive, Claudia, to the effects on the Hispanic community. I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating. To the extent to which Hispanic Star and other Hispanic affiliates can begin to organize and provide services for Hispanics who do not have the expertise or the access to business capital, to loans, to charities that they urgently need at this time. That is a service that we need to organize to provide. That is action that really needs to be taken. Because if we don't do that, we're just going to see a second wave of injustice and despair and potentially violence hit us 2 or 3 or 4 months, I don't know what the time frame is, down the road. So I think that even as we are and have to be cognizant now of what's happening in the streets and of the sense of profound despair and injustice that fuels them, something else, another train is coming down the tracks. And I think that's the Hispanic train. So let's be mindful of it and really start to think about what we can do in an organizational, pragmatic, profoundly useful way to help people who are in need now, the people who this organization devotes itself to. So that's what's on my mind, Claudia.
Bret, thank you so much. I would love to make sure that we can sit down with you, with a couple of people. We were thinking about sitting down and making a plan for recovery. Now it's urgent that we have to sit down about how do we actually stop the incredible risk that we're facing right now, even more aggravated. So I would love to sit down with you. You mentioned also how this could go into an international crisis. Fred Kemp, hi, how are you? Thank you so much for being here. You're the CEO and President of the Atlantic Council. Fred, you and I were together when the anti-globalization movement happened. Not, like I was working for the World Economic Forum, you were a journalist with the Wall Street Journal. We were there facing, somehow similar degree of anger, different though in a number of ways, but also seeing how a number of people wanted to demonstrate anger and wanted to bring up the pressure for companies to change the rules for anti-globalization, for globalization to be more fair. And at the same time, there were 10% of the people that were breaking windows. And I fear that, like in a climate like what we have right now, when young people, Latinos, they really don't know, like what's right or wrong. There's the internship programs have been canceled. There's a long hot summer coming up where we have to put also standards about what is right and what is wrong, and how do you, how do we actually talk about these internally, but also externally, taking lessons from past experiences and history, while at the same time respecting the anger and the pain that we have to go through.
Claudia, I was happy to hear David, and I was particularly happy to hear the words of my colleague Bret, who I worked with for many years at the Wall Street Journal. So I'll answer your question, but I'm going to go at it a little bit of a different way. I was downtown in Washington, D.C. yesterday, visiting our offices. We're not in our offices right now. The windows at the bottom of our building are shattered on Sunday night. There's a TD Bank there. There's a UPS office there, and they were both shattered. The hotel across the street was shattered. But I think we can't take our eyes off the issue that Bret highlighted. So I've watched the video of George Floyd's murder, 5 times now, 8 minutes, 46 seconds. For the entirety of the Atlantic Council staff on Monday, we had an 8-minute and 46-second time of silence. Because what COVID-19 is doing, a little bit like a tide going back, is it's revealing a lot of things structurally and otherwise about our society in the United States that aren't quite right, and that we have to take a hard look at. In the note, and this gets very much to your community here, Claudia, is in the note at the end of it, I tried to, well actually throughout it, I tried to link together our mission, which is working with friends and allies to shape the future, to the challenge of this moment. Because if the United States can't come together itself to take on the greatest ills of our society, if we can't come together to and get away from what Bret called the political demagoguery and divisive leadership, moments like this, we're yearning for unifying leadership, not only in the United States, but globally. We need it. Crises tend to bring us together. This one is not doing that so far. It's not doing that between China and the United States and the global community. It's not doing that within the United States. It isn't doing that in the Americas necessarily. And so we have to shift this narrative to and I'll get to your question in a second, to a more positive narrative. And we, as the United States, we can't be leaders of a global community with the global community seeing I mean, how do we take on the metastasizing cancers of nationalism and populism and authoritarianism when we're not taking them well enough in our own country? So I quoted from Martin Luther King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail to a letter to our entire staff today. 1961, he was in jail, and the fellow African-American clerics felt he was going too far in his nonviolent protests. And the quote was, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And then this is the part that I love, because this is the unifying part of that quote. "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. What a wonderful term, a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Now, I'm troubled by the violence that has come along with these protests. But what worries me the most is one will focus too much with this outlying violence, which we can take care of, and not enough at the rot and the poison, the non-biological pathogens that infect not only our own society, but other parts of the world, of bias, of racism, of nationalism, the things that we really need to take on. So what I'd really appeal for is using this period of time, this period of history, while we still have the moment, to try to unify. And at the moment, I don't think we can necessarily rely on our political leaders to do that, whether it's Chinese, whether it's American, or whether it's otherwise. And so I think you know, bodies like Hispanic Star, other movements, have to step up, and we have to be steadying voices and steadying forces ourselves. And instead of being in despair about what's going on around us, I think we have to redouble our own efforts to provide some hope for the future, because heaven knows we are in a situation where medical progress, educational progress, economic progress could bring us into an era that's one of the most progressive in human history and most prosperous in human history. But this could also turn in another direction. And this is the dividing line, the COVID-19 dividing line. So I applaud the work that you're doing. And I also applaud what Bret was talking about regarding the Hispanic community. I think that's a wonderful idea and initiative. And I saw a note in the chat room here, not to forget that that this Hispanic Star also is embracing of Afro-Latinos. And so any underprivileged communities, or communities that are not underprivileged, but being hit hardest through this period of time, we have to address if we're going to be the United States that we all aspire to be.
Fred, what do you think? We have within the Hispanic Star more than 30 or more Hispanic organizations and more than 100 Hispanic leaders. We can actually come together and say something and step up and make, you know, like, and speak up. What do you think are the most important points that we could say respectfully at this time?
You know, the reason I drew upon the Martin Luther King speech is I couldn't say it better than he did. You know, I thought his quote was really quite moving. And there's another one from Martin Luther King, which is, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And I think this is a time when one can't be silent. And so I think as associations, a statement is always good, particularly if it's moving and particularly if it's unifying, not dividing, but unifying. But the question is, what actions can one take?
That's right.
And I can't recommend you actions, but I would just say it's a good time to do them and take them and announce them, but then follow through with them. Because I think what people tire of over time is rhetoric without substance. And so I think we have to the extent possible, accompany our rhetoric with some substance. We're looking at a number of things in my own organization, diversity initiatives, internships, other actions to strengthen our own organization. But I think I'd leave it to you to know best what's best for your associations.
Thank you so much. What we will do is, we know we have to do something. We know how important it is to have unifying leadership. And this is the coalition of Hispanic leaders. So we will move from statement of support. But I think that what I'm very interested is, how do we move it to action? How do we move it to positive action so that we can drive that? And thank you so much, Fred. Kemp, I would love to actually, yes?
I'd just say 10 seconds more or something. I think the other thing to get out to people is just let people know that being stressed at the moment, being anxious in the moment, being a little fearful at the moment is just a normal response. But turn it to action. That's the way to do it. We have three things going on. We have the biggest health pandemic in a century. We have the toughest economic downturn since the Great Depression. And now we have the biggest racial upheavals of America in 50 years. These three things coming together have never happened, certainly not happened in my lifetime. So you start from the acknowledgement and the recognition that something is happening that should be stressing us. Secondarily, that there are certain communities that are hit harder and feeling it deeper. And then the third part is commitment to action. So it's acknowledging, it's recognition, and then it's commitment.
Yeah, I agree. And I would love to share it with you so that, you know, like we can benefit from not only your experience, but maybe help us disseminate once we have that. Thank you so much, Fred. Yvette Pena, you're the Vice President of Multicultural Leadership at AARP. You are an Afro-Latina yourself, and you are a leader of the Hispanic Star. We admire what your company is doing. We admire what you're doing, the leadership that you're taking to bring the company forward. What are you doing in the company? What are you seeing? What are best practices that you want to share with other companies? And what would you recommend in this time for other organizations to do, particularly when it comes to multicultural diversity and inclusion actions?
Well, yes, as an Afro-Latina, you know, my heart is with everyone, especially all those that are caught in the crossfire and, you know, in this anti-racism issue. You know, what I want as Yvette is for everyone to be safe, for everybody to come together. And Claudia, I really commend you and all of the leaders that are on here today for coming together, because I feel that we are stronger together. It's not a cliche, but it is true. If we don't come here and have our voices heard, things won't happen. You know, one thing that AARP has been doing for over 60 years is really working to promote the health and well-being of older Americans. But we've also been looking at all of the disparities that are happening, right? Because the disasters don't create the disparities, right? They just unleash them. And we have been seeing all these disparities that have been happening when it comes to health, when it comes to all the things in housing and socioeconomic levels. And so what we're trying to do is to put out information, working very, very closely within community, because that is what AARP does best, working in community with local leaders, with all of our state offices, including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands and, you know, DC, and also mobilizing our volunteers. The power that AARP has is all of the volunteers that are on the ground day to day, really, really fighting for our older Americans and for their families. And so one thing that AARP does very well is that we inform and we educate. No one has to just be a member in order to really benefit from what AARP is doing. And so, you know, when this pandemic hit, the first thing that we did was see who is this affecting? And oh my gosh, it's the older Americans and their families. And we needed to make sure that we were relevant. You know, in the team that I'm from, in the multicultural leadership team, we took a look and we saw all of the different audience that had different needs, not only with the disparities, but think about the language barriers. And so, you know, we came out with a lot of information in English and in Spanish and in different dialects of Chinese to get information out, to get this information, not from the national perspective, but nationwide, in the sense that we build all of these resources and created websites so that our state teams can go out and help our people. I mean, it's what we do. It's what we've been doing for 60 years with our advocacy, especially to having people protect themselves. And so, you know, we created a couple of websites. I'm going to give them shameless plugs because this is where all of the information is housed. And I really hope that people write this down: www.aarp.org/coronavirus. And we have one that mirrors directly in Spanish, aarp.org/el coronavirus. And so what we do best is we educate and we inform. And, you know, in these websites, there's information on how to take care of yourselves, bringing in all the expertise that we have. It shows how we're fighting for our members and our caregivers and the whole, 50+ community, with on a bipartisan basis to make sure that all of the lawmakers, are allocating the sufficient resources to address all of the issues in the outbreak. Also protecting all the vulnerable seniors and staff in nursing homes. We've seen what's going on there, how our people are dying, especially people of color. So we're trying to, pass these legislative laws that help improve the safety, right, for the most at risk, to protect them. And we know that more than 35,000 COVID deaths can be traced to these healthcare facilities. And so for us, it's really, really important also that Social Security recipients do not have to file a tax return to get their money. And so you can see the pattern here. All the things that we're doing are to really help the aging populations and their families, to give them information, to give them access. But there's so much more to be done as well. We focus on our caregivers, Claudia. Our caregivers, there's more than 53 million unpaid family caregivers, right? And all of them are carrying out all of these routines. So we have assets and information to really help them, really tell them also how to, stay connected to their loved ones, like what we're doing now via Zoom, via FaceTime, to track them and track their medications. And so, we're really putting all this information out on the website to help, to come together in Spanish, in English. We also have resources against fighting fraud. I know all of you probably have been hit with all of these scammers, that are talking about phony vaccines, all the scams on the COVID testing. And so, we have our AARP.org Fraud Watch Network, and AARP Contra el Fraude, because we need to make sure that we are highlighting all of the issues and telling people where to go. We also have these lines in English and in Spanish. And so what we do best is inform, educate, give information, and really, really come together, really listen to the needs of the Latino community and go out and address them. And so, our main call to action is to really go to our websites, to really look at the information available in language, and to use the phone numbers. We know that our Latinos like to speak to someone. And so also on the websites, there are numbers. And so again, what we're doing is to try to keep people connected, keep them informed, and really make sure that safety first, that everyone is safe.
Yeah, and I'm very grateful. Thank you so much for doing that and educating and informing. But also, what all the data indicates is that Hispanics, they were already having issues in saving and planning for the future, and now it's even worse because not only COVID, but now the little store having hit. So I think that you're going to have even a harder, we're going to have to redouble the effort to inform, educate, but also procure for a solution so that people can really be, Hispanics age with dignity and with everything that they need. So I know how hard that is. Thank you so much, Yvette, Pena. I really want to commend you as well. At the personal level, you keep on advocating for other companies to bring on board and to bring to bring corporate America to be more Hispanic friendly. So at the personal level, I think you're a Hispanic Star, and I'm very grateful for you for being here. Cristina, Antelo, you're a partner of Ferox Strategies, and every week you bring us the latest from Washington policy and politics. In this, I would love to hear your take about what's happening this week in Washington, and whether all the focus right now is going to move from COVID, an emergency, to dealing with this situation, and what is the risk of that?
Sure. I'll give you a little bit of an update on Corona response, and then move over to the unrest that we've seen this week. The House passed last week just a update to and some technical fixes to the PPP program. The Senate is scheduled to take that up today. They were supposed to take it up last night, but because of the curfew in DC, I think they evacuated the Capitol a little quicker than they normally might have. The protections or the fixes that are made will extend PPP program until the end of the year, as opposed to expiring this summer. It also will allow the performance period from the current 8 weeks to 24 weeks, which means businesses will have more time to utilize those funds. And importantly, it fixes the 75-25 rule I think I've mentioned on this call before, which meant that a business had to use 75% of the loan proceeds for payroll only. That will now be reduced to 60%. There are many businesses, restaurants, for example, that have fixed costs that are a bigger portion of their need. For example, rents or mortgages, things like that, or their supply chain. And so now they'll have more flexibility in how they can use those funds. There's also been some additional optimism. Mitch McConnell, the leader in the Senate, has now told us that he does see a fourth package. He does think that there will be a negotiation for that, but he doesn't see that will come together until later in June and into July. But at least he has set the groundwork that there can be an additional discussion. The package passed by the House is over $3 trillion. I think that the Senate has a great deal of spending fatigue, and that price tag will come down. There are several things that they've already agreed on that I think take up a lot of that money. But I would see a final package kind of being in the $1 to $3 trillion package range, as opposed to exceeding that value. And I think that there's also some thinking that this could be a package that will allow for some other things. For example, some funding for broadband, which everybody is using, especially in rural areas and schooling and things like that. There will also be some provisions, we believe, in privacy. So the contact tracing that everybody's talking about will be required, and everybody using their phones and what all that might look like, but wanting to protect people's privacy will also be in there. Republicans are also looking to include in there a back to work bonus. So there was a lot of talk in the last package where Democrats were able to include $600 in additional unemployment insurance provisions for those that were left unemployed. Republicans argued that kept it more difficult for people to return to work, that there wasn't an incentive to return to work, and now they want to include the back to work bonus. So I think there could be some support for that. Additionally, and the last thing I'll mention here is the push for Republicans for liability protections for small businesses, which makes a great deal of sense, but Democrats want to see that paired with additional worker protections to ensure that you're doing everything you can as a business to keep your workers safe, and if you're going to require them to come back to work, to make sure they are safe, as well as your customers. Turning over to what we've seen in the last week, it is very difficult to watch, and it's difficult to know, especially for a lot of us that have lived through many iterations of this, to think like, well, what's different this time? Is it just going to be in the news for several days and then we'll go back to normal, whatever normal might mean, and nothing really happens? The one piece of hope that I would put now is that, and I don't know that this necessarily will mean that there will be a change, but what makes me hopeful that this time could be different is that this is now the 116th, the most diverse Congress ever. There are two committees of jurisdiction that I am watching now in response to this response. One is the Oversight Committee. The Oversight Committee is charged with, just like as it says, to oversee and to go back and investigate and to make sure that proper precautions were taken. This Oversight Committee has now 6 African Americans, 2 Asians, 2 Latinos, and 10 Democratic women and 3 Republican women, so 13 women. And most importantly, in my mind, it also has a female chair for the first time. And so I think that conversation changes. So instead of being a conversation by older white males kind of reviewing who don't have the actual experiences themselves, you will now have a committee that looks more like America leading that conversation and being in charge with that oversight. Importantly, also the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committees, their purview is to look over the Constitution, our laws, and how they are carried out. This is now the most diverse the Judiciary Committee has ever looked in its history, with 8 African Americans, 2 Asians, 4 Latinos, and 14 women. And I think, again, that conversation changes. And it says that I believe that there will be differences. There has already been legislation introduced that they can take up. We'll see the Congressional Black Caucus is already designed that they will meet this week and that they will have additional provisions that they will push for. The first place that any one of those provisions, whether it be an amendment or a law that prohibits chokeholds, whether it be a review of the law that grants immunity to police for any time that there is a death in the middle of their proceedings of their work, that will happen in the Judiciary Committee. And the fact that there will be 8 African Americans and 4 Latinos as part of that conversation, I hope will change that conversation. So with that, again, I have hope that maybe this time there could be a difference.
Thank you so much. I mean, like, there's a couple of things that I would like to just point out. One is I would love to make sure that we understand from you, whenever comes the time, what are the areas that we can all advocate for, that we should all be lobbying for, whether we're in a position like yours or not, whether we're like Yvette Pena in a corporate America, Ramiro Cavezos from, the Chamber of Commerce, or at the individual level, so that we can have a voice about like the things that we should be loud about, that we should be pushing on. And one of them might, and also to your resources, they are very valuable. The way that, like what Yvette offer of resources, we put them as part of the Hispanic Star, but people always want to know where can they find their resources directly to you and so on. So you mentioned something about coming back to work and getting a back to work bonus. Do you think that we should, in that spirit of getting together and advocating, do you think that we should do something so that we can, like look at the barriers of coming back together? One of them is the incentive, or is the other one a health check? Should we all Latinos look at getting together and seeing whether we have, like a symbol, a passport, some sort of like an expedite, facilitated way to be tested, and having that, and being able to use that power together?
The health passport makes me a little nervous, because your health status can change on any given day. So, is it really that valuable to say that, and nobody really knows kind of if you've had it in the past, how long that might make you immune for, whatever immune actually might mean. But to your point about health checks and coming in, your health screenings, if it's your temperature taken or other things like that, I think that goes to the broader conversation that's happening. Again, Republicans want the liability protections for businesses. I think that we should be advocating for since the frontline essential workers are generally speaking people of color, your grocery store clerks, the people who drive the buses, the city buses, the sanitation workers, all of those are predominantly places where people of color end up taking the front line. So we should be arguing and protecting for protections for those workers. So does that, is that increased PPE? Is that increased, social distancing space? The meat packing plants, like a lot of folks got sick there. It went from 700 to 6,000 pretty quickly, and that's because of the work environment that they have there by necessity and by design. So if we advocate and say, no, you have to allow more space between workers, even at a meatpacking plant that's colder, what have you, all these other things that make it more vulnerable, then that's what we should be arguing for to protect our workers. I don't know that a health passport does that, but I think that there are ways that we should work with OSHA and for other requirements to make sure that worker protections are guaranteed on the front line.
And I will be willing to work with you and with everyone else so that we can have a plan for recovery and come back fast. So thank you so much, Cristina Antelo from Ferox Strategies. Ramiro Cavezos, President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I hope that this is a week in which the work that you're doing is not massively disrupted and affected in terms of like the support that you're getting. But to Bret's point, now more than ever, we need to provide technical assistance and support for all of those small businesses to be able to access capital, to access support, to access PPPs and others. What's your update this week, Ramiro?
Well, thank you, Claudia. And I will share my thoughts into three parts. First of all, I want to thank you for always bringing us together, and it's an honor to be on this panel. Besides myself, they're always very articulate and visionary comments that we've heard today. So thank you, Claudia, for, again, your advocacy. The first thought comes to mind, as an organization, we want to be consistent, reliable, and dependable, and is no question that some of the work that needs to continue forward has required us to continue to advocate with the U.S. Senate Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. Just this week, we sent a letter to ask for the Paycheck Protection Program to continue to simplify and expedite and to lengthen the term of the utilization of the program for our small, minority, and women-owned businesses from 8 to 24 weeks. So there's no question that in the midst of everything that's going on around us that has been described so aptly well, that the trains need to keep moving. And so we have continued to advocate to make sure that we don't forget that there are many small minority, especially Hispanic-owned businesses, that have yet to get the resolution that they need on their capital access. We're going to continue to do that, Claudia, moving forward, in spite of the fact that things are really moving very fast. The second point I want to make, traditionally, as an economic developer and someone that has done job creation my whole life, you thought of economic development as reliant, and you know this because you work for the World Health Organization, water, energy, education, transportation, and leadership. Those were 5 basic elements that you needed to have basic economic development. Well, that has changed in the last 90 days. Now you need health as a proponent and as a basic ingredient for economic development. All of those things were tangible with the exception of leadership, which gets me to my last point. Leadership is this great intangible resource that we have been lacking for many, many years in this country, not just in this country, but other countries. But let me end on the note of optimism and to thank you for Hispanic Star. Just in the last week, I have seen in the midst of the murder of George Floyd, something that I've never seen in my whole life, and that's that leadership is coming from sources and circles that we've never seen before, that have been not organized or deliberate, but inspirational. So that inspires me, and it inspires me because of you and the Hispanic Star campaign. We have seen that innovation and technology has been unleashed like it never has before. We are now in a whole new era out of necessity, not because we stepped into it, but because many of us were resisting it. Now we are fully embracing it out of necessity. And so the final point is that these global protests that I heard today in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America are showing support from communities in other parts of the world that are not as economically wealthy as the US, but are showing support for Americans and for what is happening. Anonymous citizens showed up a day after many of the protests to clean up these centers of business, to bring them back to where they were before. And the last 2 points, I'm inspired by the fact that our health leaders, Dr. Nabarro and others, that we might have a vaccine by the end of this year, which again would be a historic accomplishment. And last but not least, capital in the future, access to capital for Hispanic-owned businesses is not going to come from traditional sources. It's going to come from thousands of avenues of opportunity from the private sector, from community development finance corporations, and from non-banks, in addition to existing banks. So Claudia, thank you for this forum for us to talk to you about where we're at. We're going to continue to push forward to represent Hispanic businesses and know that we're going to come out stronger in the end.
And I want to thank all of you, but also finishing with the message of unifying leadership. The people here, you Ramiro, you Yvette, you represent thousands of people like all across the country. We need to have a unifying voice. We need to have a unifying voice supporting each other, condemning racism and discrimination, but also making sure that people understand that violence is not the way to go, and that we have to be together, and that we have to make sure that we put pressure on the constructive solutions that we want to be solved, so that systematically we can really take this opportunity to generate proper change. So let's be united as leaders. Let's condemn racism and discrimination. Let's remind everybody that we are all human and that we're here to move from tolerance to acceptance, and we can do it, but do it in a way that is constructive for all of us, constructive and not destructive. And this is the time for all of us to step up and be the leaders that our community expects us to be. Thank you so much for being here. See you next Tuesday. Thank you. Bye.